Chromanoids. 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 Chromanoids.
Okay, welcome Jessica Ngan, Diana Cristobal, and Bart-Jan Polman to Chromanoids. The three of you are architects. You have developed your career in many different offices. You have your own careers as practitioners, but also as researchers, and currently as PhD students in Princeton University. I would like to begin, of course, with the question, are you human?
Well, that was indeed the question that triggered our research, no? And we took it, the question of the creators, we took it as a starting point to answer with another question, which was, are we normal? No? Because we were interested to analyzing how the concept of normality has been a concept that has been constructed in architecture, but also in the sense of constructing the normal human. So, I mean, in many other disciplines, for example, the concept of normality has been investigated in statistics, in biology, in medicine. So we were actually interested in how the concept of normality was actually constructed in architecture and in design.
And more specifically, through two very specific case studies, which is the Neufert guidebooks that is being used still a lot by architects worldwide, and the Dreyfus guidebook, which is used by architects and industrial designers primarily in the States, but other countries as well. Yeah.
None of us are normal, so that's I think something that came out of our own question. So yeah.
Okay. No, that would be like my next question. No.
Yeah.
So, are we normal, or are you normal?
Yeah, I mean that was. What we actually aimed with this research is to render visible the fact that the idea of the normal as the idea of the human is an extremely powerful ideological tool, no? That has been instrumentalized in so many different ways in many disciplines, and as we were saying before, but also in architecture, no? And that's something that usually is not very is not taken into account. We consider, no? That it has been something that has been absorbed by the practice and by the way that people design nowadays, or offices or design nowadays, that we wanted to actually make it or render visible not only the historical constructions of this term, but also render visible the contemporary problematics, no, of this term.
Right, I think that's a key point, because I think one of the main arguments we're trying to make is that a lot of the content that has entered these books is in fact is problematic in many ways, because the normal, obviously, are we normal? No, because the normal in many ways doesn't exist, and that's what these books show, because many social constructions have entered this book under the pretense of being objective scientific knowledge, but cultural stereotypes, cliches, differences have been flattened out, which makes these books sort of objects that are uncritically used in offices worldwide, constructing all these spaces around us, whereas in fact, I think people should look at them a little bit more critically. Yeah.
And I guess one of the things that came out from us trying to look at it more critically is the incredible latency of some of the images that, for example, Neufert was 1936. And it has been published up until today, but many of those figures remain, actually. Even if they don't remain relevant, they're copied over and over again. So I think that's an interesting...
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually, because in relationship with some other topics, no, the Biennial, like design in time, that was, that has been a very interesting point made by the creators also. In this sense, the normal has also designed a very specific time, which is a very stable time, no? That doesn't change, that wants to remain as it is, that wants to somehow not challenge the status quo. So that was something that for us was also interesting, no? How this term has different temporalities in itself, and how to render visible all those temporalities.
No, absolutely. In the work, well, Of course, what you are showing is the history of the Neufeld and the history of Dreyfus, no, particularly, and the humans that they were depicting. Not only the humans, but also some of the designs that are like kind of prerogatives, no, for architects in a way. And what it was like really striking, like this kind of extremely violent image that you were showing through your project, is that nothing changed, no, as you have said.
Yeah.
But nothing changed even in different countries or even in different cultures, no? Because we are going just like to confront the Neufeld and the definition of what a family is in the German edition, that it was the first one, no? And in the Japanese edition, no? Or in the Turkish edition, because it's a little bit like the Bible or the IKEA catalog, no? That it is like everywhere.
Yeah, we have to say actually that, I mean, if you take the idea that the human, it's not only the body, I mean, obviously, of course, we were very interested in the depictions of the body, no? So that was our starting point, and that was where we actually spent most of the time. But actually, you can see that also in the architecture, which is a little bit not what I think are the differences from Neufeld and Dreyfus. That in Neufeld, you can see this stability and this not changing also, like through looking at the kitchens or through looking at the plants or through looking at actually the spaces, that in some sense the space also designs the human that is portrayed. So that's also something interesting, we believe, no? That it's not only those figures that don't change, but actually, as you're saying, no, that in different countries, in different times, like across a time span of almost 100 years, those spaces remain depicted in the exact same ways.
Yeah, the figures, the drawings get updated, but the social constructions do not. Like in the 36 edition, or in the 1960 edition, for example, there's all the domestic labor tasks are being performed by women. And then the difference between the two books is that eventually the skirt will get a little bit more short, a little bit more high-tech, but the role, the sort of nuclear family role that is present in all these books, it doesn't really change. But what is fascinating also is, like, in the geographical spread of these books, like sort of different nuances enter the books. For example, exactly the same book, the same content, in English would be called Architect's Data, so it has this scientific label, like it's a data, it's objective, and in Spanish it becomes The Art of Designing. It's the same book, but the title gives a completely different connotation, and I think says a lot about the design culture in different ways. Geographical.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pushing a little on the reception history of it. What does it mean when there's a whole spread of Western beds, for example, in the Japanese edition? I mean, I don't think it's as simple as, oh, they're trying to learn how to, you know, it's not a direct one-to-one translation. Like, what do you see when you see in the handbook that your culture isn't reflected? Is it a voyeuristic view? Like, what is, I mean, I think it's more complicated to actually understand the reception of these books.
And why do you think it's so pervasive? I mean, because it obviously has been confronted. There are some other possibilities in architecture. This has been so much discussed, no, in a way. Not your project, because I think that your project it was like precisely amazing because of that, no? Because suddenly when we were just like having like all of these editions and all of these images, we are realizing how violent it was, no? But how and why it is so pervasive, no, in architecture, like Neufeld's or Dreyfus figures?
Yeah, I guess it might have to do also with the way in which it's rendered, which was something that we were very interested in, also the visual language, and the fact that, yes, as Bart-Jan was saying before, no, that it's rendered through a language of objectivity or neutrality, because they also, no? So the drawings that are just silhouettes, or the plans that are black and white diagrams. So in a sense, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess maybe the visual language tends to argue that this is something that has no cultural or ideological construction whatsoever.
Yeah, that would be one thing. And I would say, added to that, which is purely hypothetical in a way, I think also these books very much serve in a sort of monopolized position. In other words, there's only Neufeld. There's not really, or has been, a true alternative to Neufeld that was as successful, and therefore there was never any sort of, let's say, dialectic between two like books. So the content was only developed from this very specific 1936 edition that kept being updated and updated and updated, but never was critically, there was never an alternative, let's say. And I think that sort of caused that it has been so pervasive over time.
Yeah, at the same time, it's enmeshed in the same logic of building codes of mass production.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so embedded
yeah.
in other institutions.
Yeah, I think building codes have a lot to do with that, because the construction of law is actually very related with the construction of those books, no? And that's something that's in a further research, for example, it would be super interesting to know, like what influenced what, and do building codes actually change because of those were actually constructed because of the books.
Especially the early editions are full of the German industry norms. So all the industry norms entered. And,
My last question would be, in your research, did you see some of the reception of these books? I mean, there were like some, I don't know, like counter-Neuferts, for example, or people that were just like trying just like to say, okay, we are going to use a completely different code, no, but in a very activist way, you know, in a way.
Well, the Chinese edition, I think, would be.
But that's not an activist way, I would say. But the Chinese is an example of
Yeah, the Chinese edition uses the structure of Neufeld, but it redraws the drawings, and it's really a completely different book in a way, but draws heavily from it. But perhaps another example of.
No, we came across different. There's also a Dutch version, the Menselijke Maat, but it's in terms of activism. No, there have been art projects in the past. I think there's a sex Neufeld that exists, and I mean, so there's different levels of transgressiveness, let's say, but as a really activist Neufeld, I'm not sure.
As a counter argument to Neufeld, I think no, not to my knowledge, no, from the perspective of art practices maybe. But as Jess was saying, I think that's also a super interesting point that in some geographies, like the Chinese Neufeld, it gets totally reformulated because somehow it doesn't really work. I mean, it's impossible to get to fit it into the Chinese culture. So they had to redo the whole book into a whole new other thing.
Okay. So many thanks, and many thanks just like for being part of Chromanoids, this chit-chat on humans, non-humans, and everything in between. That will come back soon. Stay tuned.